Hello, this is David Carney with Anave Institute, and I'm here today with Bruce Gregory, who is the editor of the Book of Andrew and one of the very first A Course in Miracles teachers. And we did an earlier conversation about his work publishing the Book of Andrew, which we'll probably refer to several times in our conversation this morning. But today I wanted to get Bruce to focus on his relationships and experiences with the originators of A Course in Miracles, Helen Schuckman, Bill Thetford, Judy Scutch, Ken Wapnick, and others. Um, so I'm so pleased that Bruce is up for doing this and has these memories to share. I think, Bruce, that you might say your entree to A Course in Miracles, the orbit of A Course in Miracles, was first with Judy Scutch.
I would agree with you with one exception, and that is that because I had been introduced to a family secret that I had never heard before, that my grandfather had been clairvoyant and had the gift of healing, that when I heard that and that it was never told to me or to anyone else outside the family because it was either embarrassing or strange or to some people even weird. They kept it a secret. But when I happened to read an article on something on the paranormal and asked my mother if she ever knew of anything quite like that, she said, "Well, I've got to tell you the family secret about her own father." And that started me on a journey that has continued ever since. And that journey led led me to people in Philadelphia, where I was in graduate school, and then on into New York City with that same search. And within a matter of months of moving to New York City in 1969, I met Judy Scutch and her husband at that time, Bob Scutch, and they had put together a foundation called the Foundation for Parasensory Investigation. In other words, the investigation of psychic things, spiritual healing, etc. And because of my interest in my grandfather, who had a gift of healing, and having visited a spiritualist church in Philadelphia, where the minister slash medium had picked me out in the audience and said, "Young man," I was young back then, "you have a blue violet aura, and that means that you have the gift of healing yourself." Well, that piqued my interest. So those early events uh, helped me to keep focused. And so when I did move after getting my MBA in Philadelphia and moved to New York to work for CBS television, uh, I I would be a business person during the day, and at night and on the weekends, I would be a psychic investigator. And through that, I had the great pleasure of meeting Judy Scutch. And then uh, Judy, on my 25th birthday, Judy had invited me to attend a workshop just the previous week with Dr. Lawrence LaShawn, who was a great psychologist, but also investigator of spiritual healing. And he had come up with a method very similar to what we talk about in A Course in Miracles on moving into a state of consciousness that allows a sense of oneness with the presence of God, which allows healing, physical healing, as well as others to take place. And so he then shared what he had learned from interviewing great healers around the world with a bunch of us. And it was a powerful experience. And then on my birthday, on September 1st of 1970, I went to the bookstore and bought the book Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach, which had come out that same day. And I wanted to read it before going to a meeting in the village and with all sorts of interesting people. So I read the book after work, and it took me into an extraordinary place. Uh, I had it seemed to speak to me like none other. I wept almost throughout the entire short book, and by the time I finished the very last page, I was in a state of ecstasy. And then I went down to the party, got on the bus, went downtown to the village, and the hostess, who of course knew me and knew of all my activities and my interest in healing as well, opened the door, welcomed me in. There were all sorts of fancy people, rock stars, Andy Warhol, all sorts of people of the day back in 1970 that were there at the party. But what she told me was that one of the rock musicians had a was in terrible pain, and that she wanted me and another friend who had attended the healing workshop at Judy Scutch's apartment, the two of us, to work with this gentleman to help him. And I was still in this exalted state after having read the book, the Jonathan Livingston Seagull. And so I was introduced to the musician and got my friend Gene, and we simply, in a way, sandwiched him between us with about 5 feet on either side. And Gene and I went into that altered state, and I felt the most powerful experience of the presence of God. There was a force of love that was like wave after powerful wave of love flowing through me. I couldn't stop the tears from coming. I mean, that force of love is so strong. The only natural reaction is evidently tears. At least that was my reaction. And during the next few minutes, the gentleman who had been in such terrible pain, he said, What are you doing to me? What are you doing to me?" And I had my eyes closed, so I, of course, and was 5 feet away from him. So I opened my eyes, and there he was sitting in his chair, swaying back and forth as if someone were moving him to the left, to the right, to the left, to the right. And I simply said, "It's something, just relax with it. It's okay. We won't be long." And then I closed my eyes. And then a few minutes later, that powerful force of waves of love stopped. And I said, and opened my eyes and said to the gentleman, "Sir, I believe you can go on ahead now. The session is over." And he went off, and of course I never saw him again. But 2 weeks later, the hostess called and said that the rock musician that had been so ill and so much in pain had gone to see his doctor the very next day, and the doctor said that you have somehow been healed of ulcerative colitis, and you don't have the problem anymore. And so I said to my friend that hosted the party, I says I knew it had to be something remarkable because I'd never felt such a powerful force of love. So that kind of experience at age 25 simply reinforced everything that I had heard from my mom about that her dad had been a part of something larger than life, and that it proved to me that there is a force that is love, and that is so much bigger than what we normally experience in life, but that we have to be in a different state of mind, that something has to happen. In this case, read a book, and then that somehow speaks to a deeper part and allows doors to open, windows to open, connections to be made with something higher or deeper, so that some kind of healing or blessing or shift could be made. And so that was 1970 with Jonathan Livingston Seagull and Judy Scutch all kind of combined into one with Dr. LaShawn. And then that would have been, what, 6 years later when A Course in Miracles came, which is another book which allows, by your reading it or working with the workbook lessons, to allow a shift in understanding, a shift in perception or vision, to be able to sense that there are bigger, deeper forces available to work with you to help bring you wholeness and move your life in a very positive direction. So that's the first introduction to Judy Scutch. The second introduction that led me to A Course in Miracles was the fact that my grandfather was not only a healer, which I had sought to understand through that first segment, but he was also clairvoyant. And I'm not clairvoyant. I don't see visions. I go into a haunted house and I notice the architectural points of view, not the fact that, oh, someone was murdered over there. I mean, my psychic friends would see those things. I would see nothing, but I wanted to understand the clairvoyant part. So after 4 years of working with CBS television in the very conservative financial part of their work, I quit, went to India on a pilgrimage to be with Sai Baba and that Satya Sai Baba, which was a wonderful transformative experience, and then came back to teach Silva mind control, which was a sort of a new age program to help people awaken to gifts from within. So in that, I met lots of interesting people, and some of them invited me as a teacher to come to their gatherings. And one of them said, we use the Ouija board. We talk to spiritual guides of a lofty nature. Would you like to join us? And so I did, and then kept coming every Sunday night, and it lasted for years. And on a Sunday night, the first Sunday in January of 1976, the guide said to me with a message, this year you will encounter material that is the height of all that is practical and spiritual. It will change your life and the life of all that you teach. You do not have to worry. This material will come to you, and soon, over and out. And I thought, wow, somebody who's interested in spiritual wisdom, being able to be told that you're going to meet the best in just a little bit and you don't have to worry, it's going to come to you. 2 nights later, there was a gathering of spiritual friends in New York City, and everyone was talking about A Course in Miracles. I said, what's that? Oh, it's something that you can send off a lot of money and learn how to work miracles. I said, that's crazy. Who's behind it? They said, Judy Scutch. I said, Judy Scutch is behind it? Well, if Judy's behind it, it's got to be wonderful. So I called her the very next morning, and she lived just about 8 blocks down Central Park West from where I lived. And she said, I have a set of A Course in Miracles put aside for you for free. It's, and I said, I'll be right there. That was the fastest walk I'd ever done. And as I got to her beautiful apartment and looked at the books and started to flip through the pages, I said, Judy, I think I'm supposed to teach this. She said, go for it. And then I started teaching in that early that late winter of 1976, all over New York City and someplace in Brooklyn, taught at the United Nations, and just had regular weekly study groups with people until in June of 76, the actual book itself came out. And then all of us could study that way. And I didn't have to do mimeographs. But that's the way I met Judy. And then Judy introduced me to her friends, Bill Thetford and Helen Schuckman and Ken Wapnick and Jerry Jampolsky and so many others. So I have to be very grateful, uh, I guess, for my grandfather, number one, for having the gifts that I never knew about because he died before I was born. He died in 39. I was born in 45, but thankful for him so that it wasn't something that was kooky or woo-woo or weird. It was something that my own family knew something about: clairvoyance, sense of a connection with another world, being open to wisdom, healing, finding this presence that's available that can transform physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, that opened the door for me when I was finally introduced to it in graduate school. I never knew about it before, although I had when I was about 4 years old, uh, an encounter in the woods with a magnificent angel. You know, I wasn't frightened because the angel was beautiful, wings and colors and and then I heard this voice coming inside of my head from the angel that said, "I'm here to remind you that you agreed to help with something important, and it's important that you remember this." And so, I'm just a little twerp, this little kid about almost 4 years old out in the woods by myself with an angel. And I hear this and I close my eyes. And the only thing I could imagine that it was appropriate was, I must remember this. I must remember this. I must remember this. And then I opened my eyes and the angel was gone. And I didn't say to myself, oh, that was silly. What was that all about? No, I knew it was real. And I just kind of went, okay, he did his part. I agreed, and it's done. I don't know what I've agreed to, but someday I'll understand it. And I put it on my back burner, if you will, and just knew that someday I would encounter something important that I would be helpful with. I was not the one to give it to the world, but I was somebody who was going to be helpful in something important. Now, I'm going to be 80 in just a few months, I can look back on that experience at age 4 and my experience at age, let's see, I guess it'd be my early 30s, of being introduced to A Course in Miracles, and see that that was the important thing. And then eventually, the very next year in 77, uh, helping uh, Bill Thetford's former lover, Charles Lehman, to bring through the Book of Andrew, which was a powerful remembrance of his life as the disciple Andrew. So, in other words, there are just lots of people that are part of this particular adventure, if you will, this spiritual adventure of discovering what is it I'm supposed to do with my life. And I had other friends whose maybe their dad was a doctor, right? And so they were going to be a doctor and they became a doctor. My dad was an engineer and a businessman, and I didn't necessarily want to do that, but it was always, what am I supposed to do with my life? So from one thing to another, finally led to the business of being involved with A Course in Miracles. So that's a little bit of my beginning with Judy Scutch and with the Miracles gang that gathered in her apartment just 8 blocks away. And in my apartment, uh, that was on West 89th Street, uh, I got to meet someone who was also involved with A Course in Miracles later, and she was a cabaret singer down in the village. And I went down to hear her, and she was wonderful. Her name was Mary Ann Williamson. And and one day she knocked on my door, and I said, "Come on in, Mary Ann." And she saw that I had a copy of the Course in Miracles books on my coffee table. And so as we sat down, she asked me, "Can you tell me more about these books? I've been hearing about them." And so I just opened up. You open your mouth and try to uh, get out of the way. And so I just spent some time talking about it and what it meant, how it worked, and why it was, I thought, such a powerful teaching. And then she just said, "Thank you very much." And then she left, and I didn't see her for 25 years. And then at the 25th anniversary of the publishing of A Course in Miracles, she was at the table signing books, A Return to Love, etc., books that she was famous for about her experience with A Course in Miracles. And when I finally moved up in line just to say hello, she dropped everything, got up and came around from the table, put her arms around me, gave me a big hug and said, "I owe it all to you. You're the one that got me started on this." And I thought, what did I do? And so sometimes when you open your mouth to say something and a higher force maybe helps you to say the right thing so that it fits the need of the person, it can make a difference. So there's another part of the story that of working with Marianne Williamson. So it's a fascinating adventure.
Sounds like you would have been friends with Judy before she was even introduced to A Course in Miracles.
Exactly. In other words, at that point, Judy and I were both spiritual seekers and had not found this remarkable text and workbook that spoke so personally and so powerfully to human needs and with solutions to those particular problems. Uh, Judy, evidently, I mean, I knew Judy as a lovely, happy, radiant person that was full of life and full of the quest for spiritual truth. But I didn't, because I was not with her 24 hours a day, just a few times from here and there. I could not see that she, like me, were still, working on big issues and had challenges that she didn't have answers for. And it was only in 1975 that she was introduced to Bill and Helen through a mutual friend of mine as well, Douglas Dean, uh, a professor and engineer out in New Jersey, who sort of brought everybody together. And then, when Judy saw the material, she knew that this was her path home. And when now I've had others who are more, shall we say, psychically inclined than myself. Woody Norquist was a friend from Brooklyn back in those days. He was very much involved with selling pyramid products. And because I was a silver mind control instructor, he I got to know him through that. Anyway, when I told Woody about A Course in Miracles, he got a copy of the book, and he said, when I simply opened the book up the very first time, I got this blast of light, just an enormous, brilliant light, just shining from the book and flooding my whole being. He says, I knew this was the book for me. and it was the book for the rest of his life. So each person has his own reaction, and sometimes those reactions are not so positive. I mean, Judy's told me more than once that she would toss the book across the room, or, some there's many a person that's tried to get rid of that book because it spoke too quickly or too personally to them. But anyway, but I digress, as they say.
Now, how did it come about for Judy to? I assume it was Judy that introduced you to Bill and Helen.
Yes, I guess I don't remember the exact details as to whether I simply dropped by for a particular purpose, or whether she said, "I want you to meet some friends." And it's probably the latter. But when I got to her apartment, which was in the Beresford, one of those beautiful pre-Wall Street crash buildings on the corner of 81st Street and Central Park West, just north of the Museum of Natural History. It was just a magnificent and beautifully colorful apartment up above, and so that you could see Central Park from it. It was, I mean, a very worldly place, like we've arrived. I mean, that building had people like Mike Nichols and Barbara Streisand. I mean, just folks that lived in that building that were famous. So it was a worldly place. And yet once you got inside of Judy's apartment, you knew you were in a different world, a spiritual world. That's why I called it Miracle Central. And so she introduced me to Helen and to Bill and to Ken Wapnick, and then eventually to Jerry Jampolsky, and so many others that were involved in a peripheral way to A Course in Miracles, and also to the spiritual consciousness movement. And I got to talk with Bill a little bit longer than I did with Helen. Helen was very precise, very pleasant, but sort of businesslike, a little bit more reserved. Bill was a little more friendly and more open to me, and as you can see from this interview, I'm somebody that has lots of stories to tell, and I'm glad to do it. So I was willing to share with Bill Thetford that I'd had some remarkable experiences with uh, hypnosis, with past life regression for people. I'd been trained in hypnosis as a Silva mind control instructor on how to help people to achieve a deeper level. Silva called it the alpha state from brainwave studies. But in any case, seem to be good at putting people to sleep. Now, some people might think that that's not so much a compliment, that I bore people, but I found that I was able to help people that needed to relax, that needed to let go of stress, that I had that ability. And maybe I had some kind of comfort or confidence that I exuded to them so that they felt, I was somebody legit. So I was able to work with people and take them back to childhood memories and then back to past life memories with a degree of emotional and psychological impact that basically changed their lives for the good, for the better.
And so
And
you already
yes,
had that training when you met Bill.
yes, I did. I'm someone that, again, maybe all of, many of the folks of your friends and in your audience for this recording will will say that I was on a quest. I had this burning desire to find more, to read more, to meet people that had these gifts or had this ability to transcend this world, to find the truth of reality. And so that was me. I I say to myself that I'm, whatever DNA I have from my ancestors, somehow I also have pit bull DNA and bloodhound DNA, that I seem to be dogged in my pursuit of something like a pit bull that it wants to go after something, and a bloodhound of wanting to sniff out the details and the meaning, and look for the clues. It's a gift in a way that's just part of my personality that turns on, especially having to do with spiritual things. And so I wanted to know more, and then of course life is not just what you do yourself. There's others that help you. And so I made friends with people in the consciousness field, if you will, in the New York City area. And so they would come to me and say, "Oh, you must go to this workshop. Oh, you must read this book," etc. So I was helped tremendously by others. And so before I ever got to meet Bill Thetford and talk about past lives to this eminent psychologist, I mean, I really didn't know his background, chairman of the Department of Psychology at the medical school at Columbia Presbyterian. Oh, I mean, who would presume to talk about psychology or hypnosis to one of these eminent people in the field? But I'm somebody that is easy to I will easily share what I know with anybody without, being concerned. But so I had studied hypnosis with Silva. I had read all the books of Edgar Casey and all the various other people in the field, like Joan Grant, her wonderful novels that she published back in the 30s, 40s, about her past life experiences, and even got to meet Joan Grant and her psychiatrist husband through Judy Scutch, who was a good friend of Joan's. Judy knew everybody. And so if you were Judy's friend, you got to meet the most marvelous people, and go to patio parties on people's penthouses in New York. Had lots of fun that way. But in any case, because of the work with hypnosis and past life, I was sent clients, if you will, because I didn't advertise. I was sent clients before A Course in Miracles came, that helped me with this quest that I seem to have from my teenage years of who in the world was Jesus? What was he really like? Because I had a feeling that he was just a regular human being that was deeply spiritual, deeply wise, and deeply one with God, but different from what I heard in church or what I read in the New Testament. So I wanted to know more. And then when I started doing hypnosis for past life regression, and people said, "I'd like to have you work with me," one of the people that came remembered being the Samaritan woman at the well, where Jesus met her and was very kind, and but also very honest about her life. And she was transformed by that particular uh, experience with Jesus. And when I heard this woman in trance speaking about the real Jesus and what he was really like, I was transformed, because I thought, this is not only a technique that is helping other people recapture some of the depth of their soul's experience that has meaning for them now, but this is answering my questions about who was this Jesus that we call Jesus Christ. And that was not the only one. I had another client who was probably 26, 28 years old, a young man, And he went back and he says, I'm a Roman centurion and I'm leading people. I'm in Palestine. And we're coming across that Jesus. And he's giving a sermon to people. And everybody seems to be so enraptured by this guy. We've got to do something about him. He's going to cause trouble. He is trouble. And then he said, oh, he's turned away from looking at the crowd and he's looking directly at me. And oh, oh, and I've never felt such love in all my life. And he started sobbing, just sobbing with the experience of feeling not anger, not violence, but the power of the love of God flowing through Jesus to him. It melted him. And so here was a young kid, in his 20s, lying down in trance, sobbing, soaking his shirt with ancient tears. And there was another example. This is what Jesus was like. This was the power that he had, not anger, not viciousness, not violent judgment and hell and condemnation, but the power of love to transform. And then another remembered being a rabbi who was worried that Jesus's teaching might be a little bit troublesome for the order of the day, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, in 1977, after Bill had known about the experiences that I was having with my clients, even as I was studying and teaching A Course in Miracles, that's when his former lover and best friend, they were in touch every day, that each was living. And his friend said to him, this is Charles Lehman, said, Bill, I've got to get to the bottom of this. I need to find out about my being gay, my being homosexual, and yet I'm also religious. In other words, I seem to be naturally drawn to intimacy with men, and I'm naturally drawn to a loving relationship with God. And yet, my Methodist church I grew up with as a kid, and later my Episcopal church that I was when I was in college and afterward, both of them in those days, again, the 1940s and early 50s, those days, I was condemned for being homosexual, that you couldn't be spiritual and homosexual because that was sinful. But he says it didn't feel sinful, it felt natural. I need to understand this better. That's point number one that Charles told to his best friend, Bill Thetford. The second one, he says, and the second thing is, I don't know, but I feel as though I've known Jesus, that I was maybe, somehow in connection with him. And finally, number three, I I feel a strong inner knowing that I'm supposed to remember something very important. And once I remember it, it will give me great joy and great peace. And so Bill, wanting to help his friend, said, well, I know a new friend. His name is Bruce Gregory, and he works in helping people to recapture memories from the soul that are helpful in present life functioning. So here's his number. Here's where he lives. I think he might be able to help you. And so after that invitation, after that encouragement from his best friend, even though he was a classic skeptic about all of this, he called me up and we set up an appointment in July of 1977. And he said, I don't believe in any of this. I said, it really doesn't matter that you believe in it or not. It's merely a chance for you to relax and to be able to come to terms with what your own soul wants to share with you about yourself. It's not what I'm curious about. It's it's your soul that's going to guide this. And then I told him about some of the experiences that people had had that did remember a time with Jesus. And he says, okay, let's do it. So after a prayer, because again, this whole process is a spiritual exploration. I asked for guidance and blessing and protection and all of that. And then we went back first to his childhood, remembered a few things that were significant. And then I took him back to the first past life. And he said, and of course, both of us were expecting it would be about Jesus. And at that particular point, he had also had a meeting through Bill Thetford with Bill's colleague with A Course in Miracles, Dr. Kenneth Wapnick. And when Bill introduced Charles Lehman to um, Ken Wapnick, Ken, of course, being a pleasant person, shakes hands and then looks at him, with interest and then is shocked because Kenneth is not psychic. Kenneth is not a clairvoyant like my grandfather, but Kenneth saw in sparkly gold letters impressed on the forehead of Charles Lehman a word, a name, Andrew, Andrew. And he tried to not show a sense of shock or surprise. He tried to maintain his dignity and his reputation as a professional clinical psychologist and not say, oh, I see a vision, none of that, because his reputation would be shattered, right? So he didn't say a thing to Charles about it. But when Charles was gone, he then went to Bill, who was his colleague and fellow psychologist, and said, Bill, I saw this rather unusual vision of the name Andrew just emblazoned in sparkling gold letters on his forehead. I have no idea what it means or why it came. Things like this never happened to me, but it happened to me with your friend. Do you know what this means? He says, I'm not sure, but I'll pass it along to him. So that became part of Charles Lehman's background before he met me. So he knew just inwardly that there was a connection with Jesus. He'd been having a series of dreams, of encounters with Jesus. And then when Bill told him that his very professional colleague had had this vision of Andrew across Charles's forehead, he thought to himself, well, Andrew's the name of a disciple of Jesus. In fact, the very first disciple, he was the younger brother of Simon Peter. And it was through Andrew that that whole series of 12 apostles were called. So that all of this came so that when Charles Lehman and I did that first regression, we expected to go back to the time of Jesus. But the way the soul within Charles was working probably thought this: if we go back directly to the life of Jesus, his skepticism will not be challenged because he'll say, oh, it's all suggestion. So, what was the first life he remembered? And this really shook him. He says, well, I see myself as a medieval peasant farmer in Germany, right? And I'm very proud of this very nice little orchard, a stream going through the crops. And then there's a thatched house, that thatched roof house. Oh, I says, a house? Do you have family perhaps? And then he started sobbing. Oh, my beloved wife, she's just died. And the children, and the farm, and the cow. What will we do without her? Oh, she's so beautiful. Oh, she's all my love, all my life. I'm just devastated. And then I took him forward, and he still had that longing for this beautiful woman, this wonderful helpmeet wife that he had. But he said, I'm just going to do the very best I can without her to raise our children, to take care of our farm. Then I took him to the last day of that life where he left his body and looked back on his family that was weeping. And he felt, of course, the peace and joy of being in heaven as his soul rose, out of that physical area. But then I asked him if he wanted to do another since he was still in trance. And before we get to that quickly, uh, let's go to the very end of the session in which I brought him back to regular consciousness. And his very first comment was, what was that woman thing? I love men, not women. What was that all about? I'm 100% red-blooded gay American. What was that woman thing all about? And I had to stifle my laughter. I mean, it just seemed like, because again, I'm used to this kind of thing about each life that you experience is a different angle, different focus, and you could be male or female, straight or gay, rich or poor, brilliant or dumb. Each life is a different story. And so all I could say to him was, well, if any of this reincarnation idea is true, then it just suggests that God gives us in each life a different way of looking at the human condition so that we can learn to have greater empathy, greater compassion, greater understanding of other people as we work to heal the broken relationships we find in our life. Oh, he says, I I feel so much more peaceful now. I said, well, that's great. He says, I don't feel quite so different from heterosexuals. Oh, that's wonderful. Okay. So I think that told me that first life that Charles built Thetford's best friend ever, that life was to kind of shock him into saying, this is something you would not expect. It's a life where you loved women, not men. You're a proud post Stonewall gay man right now, but in this life, you were a proud woman loving medieval farmer. And that was right for that time and that life. And that was a shocker. It didn't convince him, but it left the door open for the next vision that he had. So at the end of the farmer life, I said, well, we can do another life. You're still in trance. What, you want to try it? He says, I have a strong feeling it's going to be extremely difficult. I says, I'm not here to, give you a hard time. No, no, it's okay. I'll go through with it, but I just want to let you know it's going to be extremely difficult. I said, okay. So I said, all right, I'm going to take you through a time tunnel, step out at the count of 15 back to one. Count of one, you'll be back in another time, another place, in another body that will help you to have a greater understanding in this present life. Okay, now we're at one. What do you see? Oh, it's the worst day in the world. it's the crucifixion of Jesus. Oh, wow. Okay. And he says, I am Andrew. I see myself with the bushy beard, the rough tunic, the sandals. I'm at a distance from the crucifixion. I can still see it, but I've collapsed on the ground. And I'm just overwhelmed by the tragedy of it all. He says, I'm not really worried so much about Jesus because he's told us, and you can trust him, he's told us he's coming back in a few days, and he will, I'm sure. But right now, I'm so devastated at the way the crowds are being so mean and cruel. They're like wild animals. It's I just that's what's so devastating about someone who is but love. But he said, I'm fortunate that my childhood best friend, his name is Philip, he's another disciple, is nearby. And we've been the closest of friends since we were youngsters here. And and if truth be known, we loved each other much as a man and a woman would love, but we couldn't express it because it was against the law, against the Jewish law in Leviticus. And so we just were close and never talked about these feelings. I didn't even know about Philip's feelings. But when it came time to hear the rumors about a new rabbi from Nazareth by the name of Jesus, who was in the Galilee area doing wonderful things, we both thought that this might be the Messiah that we had heard about from John the Baptist. Both Philip and I were disciples of John the Baptist. None of the other disciples of Jesus were, but he had told us about this, and it what he had said to us reminded me at least that maybe this Jesus from Nazareth was the Messiah. So what I decided to do was to go to see this Jesus in a location the rumors around Galilee had said he'll be at that place that day. And so I went there without Philip because I didn't want to let Philip know that I loved him and wanted to be close to him because it was against the law. So I went to Jesus with the purpose of seeking how to atone for the sin of loving my best friend who was of the same sex. And so, with that in mind, he followed that particular trail. And when he got to Jesus, he said almost everybody had left. So he got there late. But there was one woman who was on her knees, hugging Jesus and weeping. And Jesus lifted her up, gave her a hug, turned her around, and gave her a gentle nudge to go back on the trail that I was coming from. And I saw this woman coming toward me, just radiant. She had tears on her face, but they were tears of joy. And she walked so like a young girl. And I was just so amazed at this beautiful vision of joy and happy tears. And then I looked again and realized that this was the old cripple woman from Capernaum that we'd all seen and knew about, of never being able to walk. I'm in terrible pain all the time. And here she was totally healed and walking like a young girl. I just said, oh my God, this is a miracle. I've never seen anything like this. And then she passed by him, and then he heard the voice of Jesus, Andrew of Bethsaida, come. And he said, he knows my name. What kind of a man is this? So he came over to Jesus, and Jesus said to him, do you love God? Oh, yes, Lord, I do. Wonderful. I'm looking for disciples. I think I think you'll be my disciple. But Lord, unclean. And and I don't even know how to read or write. Says unclean, and he looked down at Andrew's feet and made a joke. Oh, you have cloven hooves like a pig, right? And Andrew said, I kind of laughed because I realized he was making light of my being unclean. And he said, Andrew, all love is holy in the eyes of God. You are as God created you. In other words, that in this life, both you and Philip were created to be gay, to be homosexual. That was an important part of your life. This is not sinful. This is another way to love. Be that love. And then Jesus said to him, Philip will be one of my disciples. And even your brother Simon, meaning Simon Peter as we know him, even your brother Simon will be a disciple. To which Andrew was very doubtful. Oh, Lord, he said, I didn't say so, but in my heart, I knew that my business focused brother who wanted to build a shipping empire, he would never leave his shipping to be a disciple of Jesus. But that's another story. So this was the first session I had in a month. We had a second session. Charles Layman was still very skeptical because it challenged everything this very intelligent gentleman, all of his previous beliefs about being a modern, sophisticated gay man, right? So, and of course, he was no slouch. He'd been valedictorian of his high school class, valedictorian of his college class, and he had his master's in psychology from Columbia that Bill Thetford had paid for, to give him the kind of education he felt his lover deserved and needed because he was so bright. So this is the way he started. And after the second session, he was sort of in a daze and just left my apartment and walked across Central Park to his relationship with his friend at that time who lived on Park Avenue. And he just didn't know quite what to do. He later told me after about 3 weeks that he'd sort of battled back and forth for the first day or two because it was so different. How in the world could I be that person and yet I'm this person now? But he says, I just kind of surrendered with a prayer after 2 days of intense struggle. And I said, if it's to be, let it be. In other words, this inner awakening, he said, if it's supposed to happen, it's okay. I'll let it happen. And that night at 4 a.m., he was waked up by a powerful force. And then out of that came this rush of images and words and pictures and ideas about a life 2,000 years ago. He started to remember everything. And he knew that he wasn't just supposed to sit there, he was supposed to write it all down. That was just an internal knowledge. And so he grabbed paper and a pen and started writing. And the next night, and the next night, this went on every single night around 4 a.m. for 3 solid weeks. The first week, he had 50 pages of notes of these words that he heard. He said the easiest to remember were the words of Jesus. He said it was like an old nursery rhyme that you knew so many years ago, and it just came back to you, just the whole thing. And he said that was the easiest. The most difficult was to figure out who all these bearded people were, because these guys didn't have name tags on their tunics. So, he had to sort of piece that together. but he could see that he had a very special relationship with this beautiful young man, turned out to be Philip. He had this rough and tumble brother named Simon, who was his older brother, who was all business and no play, et cetera, et cetera. And so at the end of 3 weeks, these visions stopped. Not to say they were finished, but that was enough for now. And he knew to pull it all together, type it up. And then he gave me a call. He said, "Let's have lunch. Uh, I have something for you." I said, "Great. I've been waiting for 3 weeks and was a little concerned, but I look forward to lunch." So we met at lunch in Midtown Manhattan because that's where he worked as a market research executive. And then we kind of talked. He talked about what had happened, that he had these visions, et cetera. And he wrote it all down. And then he brought out a manila envelope with a manuscript and put it on the table. I opened it and it said, "The Book of Andrew, Witness of a Gay Apostle by Charles Layman." And I thought, oh, wow. And I started to turn the pages. And as I did, the tears came to mind. I mean, I couldn't stop because it was so beautiful. And I had always been concerned about, as a spiritual seeker, when I would read the New Testament, the Bible, there would be passages that would be very moving and very wise and wonderful. And then there would be other passages that would be negative and harsh and cruel and vindictive and judgmental and talking about hell and separating the sheep from the goats, all that sort of business. People being sent to hell for eternal damnation. It didn't seem right. And so it it gave me what I call spiritual indigestion. All right. And I think that maybe all of us in one sense have had that when we've looked at different paths. But this book of Andrew, that I had the manuscript, the very first manuscript in my hands, gave me no spiritual indigestion. It was pure love, pure wisdom, and so very powerful. So I told him, I said, I think you've got a spiritual classic on your hands. He says, "It's not finished." Because this was again, August of 1977. He says, I know that there's more, but I've gotten the heart of it at this point, but more is to come. I said, "Well, you go ahead and do that, and I'll always be supportive." And so 11 years later, in 1988, the last transmission. That also was the year that Bill Thetford died, on July 4th of 1988. So that interconnection between Andrew and Charles, between Charles and Bill, was absolutely essential to the fulfillment and the finishing of this work, much like Bill and Helen had that work to be done starting in 1965, ending in 1972, when the voice of Jesus came through. And so if you take a look, pull back about 30 to 50,000 feet, you notice that here are two gay men, Bill Thetford, highly professional, recognized in his field as brilliant, inventive, thoughtful, wise, etc. And Charles Lehman, also brilliant in his field of market research, etc. And both of them absolutely instrumental in bringing forth two books of very sublime, in my opinion, spiritual wisdom that speaks to the heart, speaks to the mind, and yet independently produced. It wasn't that Bill Thetford was sharing anything with his best friend Charles Lehman during the time of 1965 to 1972 about A Course in Miracles. They kept quiet. Toward the end of the transmission, Bill gave a copy of A Course in Miracles to his best friend, Charles Lehman. Charles Lehman accepted the book, opened it up, read 2 or 3 pages, closed the book, and said, "This is the ark of the new covenant, which shall be for all mankind. This is the ark of the new covenant, which shall be for all mankind," and handed the book back to Bill. He says, "I'm not supposed to read it now." In other words, I've got something else that's coming. I don't know what it is because he hadn't met me yet, right? But he said, "There's something else I have to do." And it was like 5 years later. I don't want to know about A Course in Miracles, even though I've just been overwhelmed by looking at 2 or 3 pages, and this pronouncement from on high has come through me. I'm not going to read it now. Okay. And so he gave it back. So there was no cross fertilization between the two about the two books. However, if you and I take a look at these two books now and see that these two gay men who both in their own way knew that there was something they were to do in their life that was forcing them to look deeper. Like Bill said to Helen, we've got to find another way. Whatever we're doing with psychology today is not working. We've got to find another way. Helen joins with him and says, "I will do whatever I can, Bill. I'm moved by your sincerity. Let's work together on this search." She starts having visions. 3 months later, she starts to have the voice. "This is A Course in Miracles. Please take notes." All right. So Bill was the one that had the main search, and Helen came to help him. Similarly, and I'm not trying to boost my ego here, but similarly, again, from 30,000 feet, you have Charles Lehman, who knows that he's supposed to remember something very important, which is the words of Jesus that are found in the book of Andrew, because it's an accurate past life view, like sending a journalist back in time to see what it was really like back in the time of Jesus and what he really said during those times and what really happened to those periods of the early church. And so Charles couldn't, as smart as he couldn't do it by himself. He needed somebody to help him. And here, little old me comes along going, me and my enthusiasm, "Oh, it's so wonderful, past life regression. You'll enjoy it," that sort of thing. And so the two of us together helped open the door for him to work through this incredible skepticism, to be able to say, "Okay, there's something here. I've had these questions. This seems to answer those questions that I've been struggling with internally for years. So let's do it." And then he struggled and finally said, "If it's to be, let it be." So there's always this struggle, always these stages of having to move through before it clicks. And then Chuck received his information. And then over 7 years, Bill and Helen together received it. So a lot of times people will say, "Oh, Helen Chuckman, oh, she's so wonderful." Helen is absolutely wonderful and absolutely instrumental with A Course in Miracles, but it's Bill Thetford that wanted and practiced A Course in Miracles, whereas Helen, all she basically said was, I'll be willing to take down that information. I may not be willing to work through what it tells me to do. That was tougher for Helen. But Bill said, I've been looking for another way, and I've found it, and I'm going to use it. And by the time he was ready to leave his body, he was happy as could be. So I just see these interesting parallels that in life sometimes we have people that come with a deep purpose to share something powerful that will touch the world at some point. And you also have helpers, right? Like Mr. Rogers would always say, whenever you're having problems, look for the helpers, look for the people that are there to help you to get through this, right? So Helen was a helper for Bill, and I, in my own simple way, was a helper for Charles. But through these people, we are gifted with A Course in Miracles, which is now being translated, I think 27 completed versions, aiming toward 30, and the Book of Andrew that is, has its own particular path. And so that more than answers your question. And where are we now, David?
Well, I think that probably is a good place for us to end because I my little iPad can only put up so much video on YouTube. So let me
I
hit.
thought you were going to say that it can put up with just so much stuff from some guy that some blowhard. But you're very kind.
Thanks so much. I think it's very important to weave in the story of the Book of Andrew into the history of A Course in Miracles. I see them as like cousins or step siblings, and I think it's so significant that Bill is, so central to the blossoming the the transmission of both the Course and the Book of Andrew.
And
So
also, let's not forget Kenneth Wapnick, because without Kenneth's vision of Andrew on Charles's forehead
yes,
and Bill sharing that with Charles, that seemed to be sort of a transforming impetus
yes.
that, here's somebody outside of my life who is verifying something that I've been struggling with ever since I was a little one. And one more factor, after Charles died in 1999, I went to visit his elderly sister in Tupelo, Mississippi, and told her something of this story. And she says, that's really interesting because when he was about 3 years old, we told him who named him. And it was her older sister who had named him Charles Cale Layman. And he came up to the older sister and said, Sis, why did you name me Charles? My name is Andrew. Why did you name me Charles? My name is Andrew. And she said, we don't have anybody in the family named Andrew. We named you Charles because that's your dad's name. But my name is Andrew. And then he just stalked off. So at some deeper level, a 3-year-old kid identifies with Andrew and then finally, gets the help to understand what that was all about. So I'll put that in there too. But Ken Wapnick mentioned that key thing that I think resonated and helped move it forward. So both Ken and
Yeah.
Bill, and then Judy was very much in favor of doing everything she could, but the foundation just said, well, you can't talk about a book that Helen and Bill didn't produce. So she just had to back off and just say, I love that basically what you've done is something wonderful, talking about the book of Andrew, but I can't give it the blessing of the Foundation for Inner Peace simply because the board is set up to deal with only what Bill and Helen did. So that's
Yeah.
that.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me this morning. And
Well, it's a pleasure.
it's a beautiful story that really puts Jesus in a very helpful contemporary light.
Well, it's been my pleasure to be with you, and you're a wonderful helper too. Very much so. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Bruce.
God bless.